Boys will be boys. There's natural and logical consequences in this world.
Oh, you don't like working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week? Well, that's just life.
Life is hard.
Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
The grass is always greener on the other side.
Money can't buy happiness. The customer is always right. Everything happens for a reason. It's just common sense. These are what we call aphorisms, snappy, commonly heard little wisdoms about life. I'm from the United States, but I've lived in the UK my entire adult life, and the amount of times I've heard people say, well, that's just the way things are, or that's the way things have always been here, to justify inefficient or even downright harmful societal systems and oppression. So next time your posh granddad tells you, that's just life, deal with it, you can tell him that
invoking the mythos of common sense to justify systematic oppression is kind of fascist, Grandad.
Antonio Gramsci was a philosopher imprisoned by Mussolini during World War II because of his communist writings. In prison, he wrote on notebooks about common sense as well as a concept he coined cultural hegemony. He explored the ways that oppressive systems become absorbed into normality. Labor conditions were a particular point of interest for Gramsci and other left-wing writers of his era, who argued that workers shouldn't have to sell their labor just to survive, that this shouldn't just be seen as normal. And yet, if we fast forward nearly 100 years from Gramsci's death in 1937, we find that having to work in order to survive is still very much normal in our society. Workers still, for the most part, pay the majority of their salaries to the upper 1% who don't have to work to survive, a 1% who dictate how much they pay in rent and how much of their labor they get to keep in terms of wages. So while it's just life that we have to work just to feed ourselves, it's also just life that the rich don't have to do anything at all, apart from insisting that things remain the way they are. Gramsci wants us to understand that nothing about the world we live in today is random.
Pure spontaneity does not exist in history. Spontaneity is therefore characteristic of the history of the subaltern classes, which have not achieved any consciousness of the class for itself.
What Gramsci refers to as the subaltern are essentially the disempowered majority or the other. The worker, the dispossessed, colonized persons, minorities, the disenfranchised. According to Gramsci, what this group perceives as spontaneous and creates for itself as common sense is indeed something formed and evolved throughout history, which is swayed in part by conscious leadership, by the ruling class, by those in power. When it comes to work, Gramsci writes that many of us perceive a capitalistic work ethic as being formed through everyday experience illuminated by common sense, i.e. by the traditional popular conception of the world. But in reality, such an idea has a huge history, which includes ruling class influence, religious support, and many other institutions rallying in favor of this creation of normal. I realize this might sound a little bit patronizing. I'm not saying everything around us is being constantly manipulated all the time and we're all just too dumb to pick up on it. You can put your tinfoil hats away. What Gramsci is referring to here is the way that our understandings of the world in general are often given to us at birth and remain relatively uncontested. It's less a matter of how well educated you are and more a way that our educational institutions themselves, our legal system, our psychiatric and medical systems, and the very language that we use to communicate are all taken for granted as being sort of random artifacts of the world we live in, like they just evolved naturally into being, that they're just the way things are. Rules about the way that society functions may appear like some sort of collectively agreed system that has always been here, that we're all on board with, but that couldn't be farther from the truth.
Hegemony is that state of total social authority which, at certain specific conjunctures, a specific class alliance wins by a combination of coercion and consent over the whole social formation and its dominated classes. not only at the economic level, but also at the level of political and ideological leadership in civil, intellectual, and moral life, as well as the material level, and over the terrain of civil society, as well as in and through the condensed relations of the state.
Now, so far I've been talking about common sense as if it's some easily definable, exclusive evil tool in the hands of the ruling class, but common sense is not so uniform or easily defined.
One can find there in common sense anything that one likes. Common sense is a collective noun, like religion. There is not just one common sense, for that too is a product of history and a part of the historical process.
In Christianity, no matter how much you believe your religion contains some sort of universal truth, the reality is that every person will, to varying degrees, interpret the Bible to their own understanding. And in the same way, individuals will say, well, it's just common sense, drawing from their own philosophy of the world. This whole thing is complicated too by Gramsci's question that is it not frequently the case that there is a contradiction between one's intellectual choice and one's mode of conduct? Having been raised by an ultra-conservative religious community, I often observed that right-wing Christians would claim open disdain for left-wing ideals and proudly don labels associated with far-right ideology, while at the same time engaging in behavior directly linked with far-left ideology, such as mutual aid, environmental concern, and critiques of capitalism.
The social group in question may indeed have its own conception of the world, even if only embryonic, a conception which manifests itself in action, but it also has, for reasons of submission and intellectual subordination, adopted a conception which is not its own but is borrowed from another group, and it affirms this conception verbally and believes itself to be following it.
Here, common sense is a deception. We believe ourselves to be owner of it, to be its creator, to have originated these thoughts, but we are unaware that we do not even follow our own personal models of common sense in our own behavior. I used to think I was a heartless Republican because my family passed on those values to me, but in reality, I was never really on board with a politics that devalues human life. Like, I identified with the label and hegemonic community of Christian conservatism, but in practice, I don't think that was something I really acted out in the ways I interacted with the world. Philosopher and famous jazz hater Theodor Adorno would have you believe that the reason for this kind of artificially adopted conception of the world and our complacency in not challenging that worldview is the fault of what he refers to as the culture industry.
Like some austere religious faith, football determines what you wear, whom you associate with, what anthems you sing, and what shrine of transcendent truth you worship at. Along with television, it is the supreme solution to that age-old dilemma of our political masters. What should we do with them when they're not working?
The creation and maintenance of a normality in favor of capitalism isn't just achieved by embedding capitalistic values into the bedrock of society. It is also achieved with distraction, both from the misery of work and the possibility that there could ever exist a better society. Whenever I suggest improving the world we live in any way, people comment on my videos that,
Lol, that simply isn't how it works. It sounds good, sure, but it's absolutely unattainable. People have tried to structure societies like that since the dawn of humanity. It leads to war, tyranny, starvation, suffering, etc.
Even with communism, the rich will stay rich and the poor will stay poor. At least in a democracy, you have a chance at being rich, especially here in the United States.
I'm from Eastern Europe. No one here wants socialism. Guys, you really don't understand what you are doing by campaigning for socialism. Socialism is cues, it's deficit, and it is over control from the state.
the last one is particularly funny to me because they go on about how terrible socialist states are, and the socialist states they reference as examples are the Netherlands and the UK. And honey, sweetie pie, those are not socialist states. Ah yes, the famous communist paradise, England. I'm going to address all these arguments more in part 2 of this video, but my point here is that common sense doesn't like to be criticized. If we suggest any diversion from the way things are to a common sense more in service to the majority of humans, that's shut down instantly as an impossibility. There is no escape. In fact, the only escape allowed is a monetizable escape.
The culture industry presents our same everyday world as paradise, where escape, like elopement, is destined from the first to lead back to its starting point.
This illusory possibility of literal or ideological escape replaces a consciousness that could direct us towards a very real escape or a very real realization of a better society. In this world, class identity is substituted by identities which don't threaten the maintenance of normality, like what team you support in football or whether you're a Hufflepuff or a Slytherin. Capitalism can build and monetize these group identities out of any subculture. Even anti-capitalist media, like this very video, can be consumed and identified with without threatening capitalist hegemony. As much as I wish my content existed outside this system, it doesn't. I don't even see most of the money that YouTube profits off of my anti-capitalist content, seeing as they take most of the ad revenue from my videos. If you do want to help my work become community funded, I'd be incredibly grateful. This bird just landed on top of the camera, and she's so beautiful. She's so stunning. Hello. Do you want to share your thoughts on capitalism?
The technology of the culture industry confines itself to standardization and mass production, and sacrifices what once distinguished the logic of the work from that of society.
The culture industry is a tool which presents ideals of capital to the public as common sense through an uncontroversial artistic format of recreational entertainment. When a viewer consumes media, they are not being made aware that what they are watching is advertisement.
How do you even drink that? Because it's delicious. What?
Edward Bernays, the creator of advertising as we know it, and the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, understood the needs to access and manipulate the unconscious mind all too well.
The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in our country.
Fuck, maybe Alex Jones is onto something. Edward Bernays worked extensively with corporations to mold their public image, employing the ideas of his uncle to manipulate the masses into knowing what they wanted to buy and who they wanted to be, influencing much of modern American society, and emboldening the bourgeois to more powerfully and more brazenly engage in tactics of mass population manipulation. Bernays openly declares that he is the instrument in which those in power create what we deem to be normal. But somehow it seems like this truth never really penetrates our understanding of the world. Like, we're literally being told to our very face that our concept of reality is an artificial invention by the rich and powerful, so why don't we do something about it? Noam Chomsky wrote that the general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't even know that it doesn't know. But do we even want to know?
Our brains did not evolve to be truth-seeking, but to be survival-seeking. Changing our minds is cognitively, emotionally, and energetically taxing. The human brain is a predictive processor, and prediction accuracy is contingent on homeostatic conditions. Changing our minds means we have to alter the mental model of the world upon which our predictions are made.
One of PhilosophyTube's videos a while back introduced me to the concept of doxastic anxiety, something coined by philosopher Jennifer Foster to describe essentially the fear of a change in belief, where doxastic refers to an individual's beliefs. Because our world is the only world we've ever known, the possibility of a new world can be an anxiety-inducing one. The easiest response to that anxiety is to just ostrich oneself into peaceful submission to the existing system where there is no threat of belief evolution. Doxastic flexibility also decreases with age as beliefs become ossified and neuroplasticity diminishes. A study of 18 to 87-year-olds found that there were observed differences in the open-mindedness of participants, which was the result of a reluctance to change long-established values and ideas at the cognitive level, as well as an actual physical cortical change which occurs when aging. This explains a physical resistance to belief awareness and evolution. Our understanding of the world is like a weighted blanket, which becomes heavier the longer we snuggle underneath it. When I left the Christian faith, it was an incredibly doxastically disruptive period in my life. My whole world had crumbled down around me. What I had held as true my entire life, I no longer believed in. This comfort I'd had around life after death was gone. My new beliefs put me at odds with my family, who still had the old beliefs. It was one of the most painful experiences of my life, but I think it was also, at least for me, the right thing to do. Even though it was easier to remain in the old belief system, I knew it was wrong. Neil Levy describes this as doxastic responsibility. There are situations, according to Levy, where an individual's beliefs may be totally outside their control and even exonerate them of their actions. But there are also scenarios where individuals have control over their beliefs and a moral imperative to evolve them when presented with reliable information that their beliefs might be wrong or irresponsible. But if this doxastic responsibility stresses you out, don't worry. Adorno has an out for you. According to him, we don't have much doxastic agency at all because of what he refers to as cultural tyranny. Basically, if we don't conform in belief or lifestyle or patterns of consumerism, we're condemned to economic impotence. So while we may technically possess doxastic freedoms, we are heavily incentivized against holding any views that go against the norm.
Capitalist production hems us in so tightly, in body and soul, that we unresistingly succumb to whatever is proffered to, insisting unwaveringly on the ideology by which we are enslaved.
I feel like I need a disclaimer here after that last Adorno quote, because honestly, I've had to read a lot of Adorno recently for school, and I find myself muttering "okay boomer" to half the things I read. It's okay to just enjoy things, and we don't need to psychoanalyze the origins of every single thing and whether it could be an evil imposition by the state or not. Our consumption of media can also act like a two-way tug-of-war. We can use our habits and voices to shape a common sense in a positive way.
Whether ritualized or not, art contains the rationality of negation. In its advanced positions, it is the great refusal, the protest against that which is. The modes in which man and things are made to appear, to sing and sound and speak, are modes of refuting, breaking, and recreating their factual existence.
Even Edward Bernays acknowledged that modern business must understand the changes in the public mind and be prepared to interpret itself fairly and eloquently to changing opinion. That's us. Our opinions can shape the values of the world we exist within. This is very apparent in the digital age, where companies frantically rebrand and issue statements when public viewpoints change, trying to wrap themselves around a semblance of public-approved values. They claim Black Lives Matter logos when they believe it will increase sales. This just proves that companies have no real values of their own and will never be truly on anyone's side apart from the side of profit. But at least we have some agency, however small, in being a part of those public-approved values.
Common sense can serve the purpose of overcoming bestial and elemental passions through a conception of necessity, which gives a conscious direction to one's activity. This is the healthy nucleus that exists in common sense, the part of it which can be called good sense, and which deserves to be made more unitary and coherent.
So although the pressures from cultural fascism are immense, and although common sense is a living, breathing, deeply entrenched thing in modern society, it would seem that just as it has the capacity to carry extremely problematic untruths, it also has the possibility to transform from common to good. And indeed, we have a doxastic responsibility to bring that transformation about.
Good. You're awake. We have a little bit of an issue, you and me. You see, Grelad the Kind was a Dark Brotherhood contract. Oh, fuck, wait. Wrong script.
The performative invocation of a non-historical before becomes the foundational premise that guarantees a pre-social ontology of persons who freely consent to be governed and, thereby, constitute the legitimacy of the social contract.
Judith Butler writes a lot about what is pre-discursive or assumed prior to discussion. For many of us, gender is pre-discursive. There are boys and there are girls. There are only two biological sexes, which is a fixed, well-established scientific concept. It's just simple biology is something I hear a lot on this channel, but is there anything simple about biology? When we take ideas as absolute truths based on how they were taught to us or our understandings of words, we operate in this pre-discursive world that Judith talks about. There's no point discussing anything. The ideas are pre-discursive, already established. You can take this pretty far if you want to. Like, I could tell you that this flower is a rose. And if you were a pretentious philosophy major dickhead, you could say, well, what's a rose? And then I could say, okay, asshole, put the Nietzsche down. We know what a scientific classification of a rose is. Taxonomy says a rose is this particular type of flower. And then if you were that one dude in my philosophy class who likes to constantly bring up how he speaks ancient Greek to everyone he meets, you might then provoke me even further by asking the question, but what is a flower? To which I would say, haven't you ever thought about shutting the fuck up? But even if we establish a certainty on what a flower is, we could then wonder whether our very language itself should be pre-discursive. Like, our language is necessary for the action of discursing, but it's actually incredibly limited and often can't come remotely close to describing our actual thoughts, feelings, and the various complexities of the reality we inhabit. If you're not familiar with Plato's Cave, it's a philosophical scenario where a group of prisoners are chained to a wall in a cave, and they form their entire conception of reality from shadows that are cast onto the wall in front of them. The goal here isn't to say, question everything you say, take nothing for granted. The goal is simply to say that what makes up your entire reality may not be indicative of whatever reality actually is. Our immediate surroundings may constitute our very own Plato's Cave. We find out what the world is from our parents, we learn about politics from television programs and the news, and our ideas of sex come from pornography. None of these things constitute what is real, but they can come to create what is real to us. And these shadows on our cave walls can also come to establish our understandings of what we can be, what is allowed, our moral compass, and our grasp of language. While this cave will look different for many of us, a lot of the core fundamentals will be similar if we grew up in similar cultures. This is what Adorno describes as the universal.
Culture today is infecting everything with sameness. Film, radio, and magazines form a system. Each branch of culture is unanimous within itself, and all are unanimous together. Individuals are tolerated only as far as their wholehearted identity with the universal is beyond question. The peculiarity of the self is a socially conditioned monopoly commodity misrepresented as natural.
Adorno would have us believe that stepping outside the universal or what's deemed normal will not be tolerated in our society. Our reality has to remain static and pre-discursive. If we start discursing about the reality, if we start probing at the shadows on the walls to determine their origins, we become dissidents. Going back to my example on gender, as it turns out what we refer to as gender identity today is not at all pre-discursive. The term gender identity was only even invented in 1950 by a guy named John Money, who coined the term as he began to experiment on intersex children, desperate to eliminate their nature-given biological dissidence and preserve the sexual binary sacred to social, religious, and racial purity.
A flurry of new and long-lasting tactics of sex difference emerged where race stabilizes the economic and biological health of the population, which enables the development of civilization, while sex difference stabilizes civilization, working to balance the somatic vulnerability of the impressible races by dividing the civilized body into two halves.
Far from originally being a feminist or progressive term, gender identity was originally created, in the words of Jules Gill-Peterson, to save the sex binary from imminent collapse by offering a new developmental justification for coercive and normalizing medical intervention into intersex children's bodies. Adorno's universal relies on conformity and sameness, and the sexual binary is incredibly useful to this universal, maintaining other feminist video essay cliché buzzwords like patriarchy and cis monoheteronormativity. The only thing this universal needs to maintain a pre-discursive understanding of the sex binary is to, well, discourage discursivity. It's just really simple biology, darling.
Masculinity and femininity, heterosexuality and homosexuality are not natural laws, but contingent cultural practices, languages of the body, aesthetics of desire.
So, establishing themes as pre-discursive is potentially dangerous. Understanding the historical influences that got us to our current understandings of the world and language can radically reshape how we understand ourselves in relation to our society. Nothing is pre-discursive. The very words we're allowed to use and how we understand them is tainted with socio-political complexity. I grew up seeing liberal as a word to mean left-wing, but now I see liberal as being relatively centrist or even right-wing. Throughout a lot of recent history, socialism has been a blanket term for leftist progressive envisioning, whereas the term communism in many parts of the West is associated with extreme, radical, and dictatorial social structuring. But socialism is communism. These words have been interchangeable for much of history, and both or neither could refer to dictatorships. In some periods of human history, including in some parts of the world today, identifying with communism is an utterly positive proposition, and identifying with capitalism is the more shocking, disdainful political view.
None ought to be lords or landlords over another, but the earth is free for every son and daughter of mankind to live free upon. As our land is common, so our cattle is to be common, and our corn and fruits of the earth common, and are not to be bought and sold among us, but to remain a standing portion of livelihood to us and our children, without that cheating entanglement of buying and selling. Propriety and single interest divides the people of a land and the whole world into parties, and is the cause of all wars and bloodshed and contention everywhere. We declare likewise to all laborers, or such as are called poor people, that they shall not dare to work for hire, for any landlord, or for any that is lifted up above others. For by their labors they have lifted up tyrants and tyranny, and by denying to labor for hire they shall pull them down again. He that works for another, either for wages or to pay him rent, works unrighteously, and still lifts up the curse. But they that are resolved to work and eat together, making the earth a common treasury, doth join hands with Christ, to lift up the creation from bondage, and restores all things from the curse.
Now, you might be thinking that those sound like the words of a blue-haired Gen Z kid with pronouns who's been reading too much Marx, but they're actually the words of a traditional white Christian man named Gerard Winstanley. Mr. Winstanley was a political reformer and activist who founded a group called the True Levelers, or the Diggers, which was a group that advocated for wage abolition and the redistribution of land. This group was known to occupy and plant on land that had previously been owned by the people but was later privatized. Gerard advocated for a communistic, non-hierarchical organizing of society, which would today be in line with anarcho-communist philosophy. Now, I know I just said two very scary words together that most Americans would not really associate with a cisgender heterosexual medieval Christian boomer band. But the thing is, anarchy and communism are not pre-discursive. And I don't mean to patronize, but they might not contain exactly the meanings you'd expect. In the words of Mr. Winstanley, the Bible actually advocates for a communistic socio-political structuring. And yet, in modern America, one of the greatest strongholds of Mr. Winstanley's Christian faith, the majority would disagree strongly with Winstanley's philosophies. Most Christians in the West today find communism utterly horrifying and stand strongly in opposition to it. So how is it that a religion arguably preaching for a communistic structuring of the world has become one of the greatest opponents to such a structuring? Well, to answer that question, I need to get more comfortable because this is so uncomfortable to film. Okay, so in both of America's history of Red Scares, workers in the United States were saying crazy, radical ideas like maybe workers deserve rights and freedom's cool, actually, and we don't really like being oppressed and coerced. And those in power were like, those are crazy, disgusting foreign agents trying to bring communism to the lands. This is anarchy. These dangerous immigrants are coming here and stealing our jobs and demanding rights. Also, gay people. Gay people are communist and bad. And fuck, maybe I'm gay. People comment a lot on my channel that communism never works. Communism is evil. My sister has said that communists want all Christians dead. And like, to me, this is all kind of tied to pre-discursive associations with that word. Historical examples of communism, like in China and the Soviet Union, were pretty horrible dictatorship regimes that have been unbelievably evil. But there are also capitalist horrible dictatorship regimes that are currently doing a lot of evil. It's almost like dictatorships are the problem. Like, hierarchies are bad. Maybe you're an anarchist. Speaking of communism and anarchism never working, may I present Into Evidence. In 1871, Paris became a self-governed independent entity known as the Paris Commune. It adopted a form of government prioritizing feminist, anarchist, communist, and democratic policies. While in power, they engaged a remission on rent, abolished child labor, postponed debt and removed interest on debt, abolished the death penalty, abolished mandatory military conscription, and gave the workers significantly increased freedoms. Our next act that never ever happened, apparently, is very special, so can we give it up for... From 1936 to 1937, Catalonia, a region in northeast Spain, was controlled by various anarchist, communist, and socialist trade unions during the Spanish Civil War. This was very much an anarcho-syndicalist movement at its core, a group of workers rising up to take control of their own labor. The workers took control of the businesses and factories, engaged in collectivist farming in the countryside, and they declared war on the Spanish nationalists and the Catholic clergy. The overall structure of revolutionary Catalonia was heavily defined by anarcho-communist and anarcho-syndicalist philosophy. Interestingly, a lot of their ideology was taken from The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, which is also the book that radicalized me in my own personal journey migrating from a more neoliberal understanding of the world to a, well, we could say radically leftist one. Although frankly, I don't think that there is anything radical about wanting basic human rights and freedoms, but that's just my opinion. Can we get a round of applause for Catalonia, revolutionary Catalonia? Thank you everyone. Up next, some examples of historical communism that definitely never happened because communism has never ever worked. The Black Panthers were a Marxist-Leninist, read communist, political organization founded in 1966. I don't know about my fellow Americans, but when I learned about the Black Panthers in school, I was definitely not informed that they were filthy commies. But anyway, the Black Panthers were most known for providing free school meals, challenging police violence against minorities in their communities, and being extrajudicially murdered by the FBI. I really recommend watching Judith and the Black Messiah on Netflix if you want to learn more about their story. After that amazing act, we have the one, the only. Rojava, also known as the Autonomous Region of North and East Syria, is a directly democratic region established in 2013. with policy structuring centered around anarcho-communism, democratic federalism, decentralization, gender equality, environmental sustainability, social ecology, and pluralistic tolerance for religious, cultural, and political diversity, defending minority and religious rights. They've implemented a new social justice system which emphasizes rehabilitation, empowerment, and social care over retribution. The death penalty has been abolished. The region is ruled by a coalition which operates on cooperative and market enterprise with local councils in minority, cultural, and religious representation. They have by far the highest average salaries and standard of living in Syria, with salaries being twice as large as in regime-controlled capitalist Syria. It almost sounds like anarcho-communism actually has not just the historical example of success, but a current present-day example of success, which is like being more successful than capitalism. So does it really never ever work, Jared? It's never worked throughout history, Jared? Never ever ever, Jared? The Zapatista Army of National Liberation is an anarcho-communist political and militant group which, since 1994, has controlled much of the territory of the Chiapas, which is in the southernmost state of Mexico. Political decisions there are deliberated and decided in community assemblies, and they build and maintain their own health, education, and sustainable agroecological systems. They promote equitable gender relations via their women's revolutionary law, and they want to build a world where many worlds fit, and where the people command and the government obeys. If y'all Americans think that you like freedom, these guys are laughing in your face. Their liberation theology is about as freedom as it gets. Their culture is not your costume. Now, obviously, I'm giving you a glamorized, incredibly brief, incredibly unnuanced introduction to these societies. The Paris Commune was really kind of a mess for bloody reasons and inefficiency reasons, and there are, in some cases, definitely legitimate reasons for these societies failing. I'm not trying to sell you on some utopia, but to say that leftist societies never work or can't work, or that capitalism is obviously an inherently better system because duh, is just not true. Are there historical examples of communism and anarchism working? Yes. Are there present-day examples of them working? Yes. The Zapatistas and Rojava exist in the same world you're living in. The problem with many of these leftist societies is just violence. When Gerard Winstanley started his anarcho-communist colony in 1650, neighbors took fright with his activities and sent armed thugs to beat them off the land. Not because he was harming them in any way, but because his radical freedom threatened their hegemonic rule and the status quo. They broke free from common sense. They turned common sense into good sense, and although that benefited the majority, the minority of those in power didn't like that very much. The Paris Commune had many flaws, but it may have had a chance at success if the ruling classes hadn't come in and murdered them all. The Zapatistas and Rojava are still around today in part precisely because they are okay with violence in service to self-defense. And while they may be painted as violent anarchists, they have only adopted violence out of a necessity to maintain their freedom from oppressive colonial neighbors. Like Mexican paramilitaries who murdered one of the Zapatistas' great peaceful leaders in 2014, or when the FBI decided to murder an innocent Black Panther leader. Other leftist societies have only failed because of foreign intervention from the supposed capital of freedom and democracy, the United States. My goal here isn't to propagandize to you about my evil, morally bad, transsexual, colored hair pronoun communism. Actually, no, wait, that's exactly my goal. But seriously, more than anything, I just want to introduce complexity into communism and anarchism as concrete ideas with concrete histories. As words, these are not free from problematization, and they don't have simple histories. Language can end up carrying mistruths even with the most subtle of twists and changes. Instead of communism, I could say socialist. Instead of anarchist, I could say libertarian. Anarcho-communism is also known as libertarian socialism, the former carrying a whole history of negative assumptions, equivalent for many to endorsing violence and lawlessness and chaos under anarchism and evil big brother dictatorship under communism. But libertarian could be seen as even conservative or be read as just freedom, whereas socialism is most often seen today as just state-endorsed welfare within capitalism. These are different words which have incredibly similar meanings in the dictionary, but they contain very different meanings within historical and cultural context. Leftist thinkers Angela Davis and David Graeber and others would tell you that your association with democracy and freedom is totally misplaced.
The real origin of the democratic spirit, and most likely many democratic institutions, lies precisely in those spaces of improvisation just outside the control of governments and organized churches.
Angela Davis writes in Lectures on Liberation about how in Greek societies, the origin of democracy, freedom did not include slaves and primarily only referred to the privileged Greeks of society, not foreigners. This makes a lot of sense when you think about the fact that the United States, which often proudly compares its democratic origins to Greece, was also founded on a constitution that talks about liberty and freedom for all, while adopting slavery, not giving women any rights, and obstructing actual attempts at the freedom of other peoples like Palestine today and many other countries throughout history. Palestine is indeed the perfect example of words being warped in favor of hegemonic ruling class designs. You could look at what's happening right now between Israel and Palestine and call it a war, but it has approximately a 75% civilian casualty rate, which is, not what a war is. We have another much more accurate term for that, but such a term is labeled political. You could lose your job, be kicked out of the Labour Party, or worse, arrested as a terrorist. When Palestinians are killed by Israeli bullets and bombs, they are not murdered, according to the press. They are simply found dead under mysterious circumstances. If we take out any prediscursive or political lens of our words, we find something far more truthful and honest. To me, anarcho-communism says humanity. To me, genocide is a word needed to hold our very humanity accountable to its horrors. To me, democracy and freedom are no more liberating than they are fascistic in their current installations in Western society. The result of a prediscursive world is a fatalistic world, a world where we accept everything bad because, well, it's just the way things are and the way things have always been. But that's not a world I want to live in.
What if freedom were the ability to make up our minds about what it was we wished to pursue, with whom we wished to pursue it, and what sort of commitments we wished to make them in the process? Equality, then, would simply be a matter of guaranteeing equal access to those resources needed in the pursuit of an endless variety of forms of value. Democracy, in that case, would simply be our capacity to come together as reasonable human beings and work out the resulting common problems, since problems there will always be, a capacity that can only truly be realized once the bureaucracies of coercion that hold existing structures of power together collapse or fade away.
I want to create a collaborative good sense, one filled with empathy and minimal in assumptions. Ultimately, my politics are beyond label. I don't care if we use the word communism or anarchism or anarcho-communism or boy or girl, gender identity, democracy, freedom. I care about a pre-discursive humanity, about living in a world where we, as the people, get to rule ourselves, where we get to be whoever we want to be, where true freedom is celebrated and standard, and nothing is taken for granted or held as normal just because. Especially when that normal isn't doing most of us any good.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. It was kind of a lot of work to film, so if you do want to pop $1 or $2 over on Patreon, I would be very, very, very grateful, but no pressure. I'm currently in the throes of essay season once again, so it may be a hot minute before I get the next video out, but I have a few scripts that I'm working on and I'm excited to share them with you guys. I will see you in my next video. All right, is Dobby allowed to leave her little hole in the wall now?
hard. Life is hard. Life is hard. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's what I do. Welcome to the real world. Matrix music plays. Fuck. What's the other line? Fuck. Oh, welcome to the real world.
Oh, girl.
Oh my god, can we go home?
Yes.